When I first walked into the glass-walled conference room at Synertech Systems, I could feel the weight of 3 decades of engineering experience pressing against the glossy, modern sterility of that place. My name is Michael Harrington, and for 32 years I have lived and breathed mechanical systems. I started my career when drafting still involved pencils and blueprints you could roll under your arm. Over time, I adapted, embraced CAD software, and even learned to work alongside machine learning algorithms that optimized our designs. But there was one thing I refused to give up: the old-school principles of structural integrity and manual validation that had saved me and my employers from catastrophic failure more times than I could count. At Synertech, I was a senior lead engineer in their Advanced Systems division, overseeing critical design projects for aerospace clients. My specialty wasn't glamorous, at least not to the younger hires who could code in Python with their eyes closed. I was the guy who cross-checked stress tolerances, who ran the boring calculations by hand to make sure the fancy software wasn't giving us garbage results. And I was good at it. My methods didn't just save time, they saved reputations and, in more than one case, lives. But Synertech wasn't the same company it had been when I joined 10 years ago. The new CEO, Lucas Trent, a 30-something tech wunderkind, believed in disruption above all else. He brought in a wave of fresh graduates with impressive degrees and buzzwords like next-gen and AI-driven practically tattooed on their foreheads. During meetings, they'd look at me as though I were a relic from a bygone era, a dinosaur clinging to relevance. At first, I ignored the smirks when I suggested verifying automated outputs or the subtle digs, when I reminded them that simulations were only as good as their assumptions. But there were moments, quiet ones, that told me the tide was turning. Like the day Lucas called me old school in front of the entire team, his tone hovering between mockery and dismissal. Or when a junior engineer, who'd been on the job less than 6 months, was promoted over me to lead a high-profile client project, with Lucas declaring it was time to let the new blood take the reins. I told myself it didn't matter. I still had my work, and my work spoke for itself. Yet, deep down, a quiet unease started to grow. It whispered to me every time I watched Lucas stride through the office with his entourage of young executives. Every time my suggestions were brushed aside. Every time I caught my reflection in those sleek glass walls and wondered if I'd already been written off. Still, I clung to one unshakable truth: experience is not a liability. And though they didn't know it yet, they were about to learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate someone like me. It happened on a Tuesday, of all days. Tuesdays had always been my rhythm days, the midpoint between getting my bearings on Monday and pushing toward the weekend's finish line. I walked into the office carrying a thermos of coffee and a binder of recalculated load-bearing figures for the Branson project, one of our largest aerospace contracts to date. Something about the software-generated models hadn't sat right with me, so I spent my weekend double-checking the figures manually. And I was right. The AI-optimized wing strut configuration would have failed under real-world stress. My binder contained the corrected design, along with annotated notes explaining exactly where their algorithm had gone wrong. I didn't get the chance to present any of it. Lucas called me into his office before I'd even reached my desk. He was seated behind his pristine white desk, flanked by 2 HR representatives, faces I barely recognized but whose presence told me everything. My gut tightened. "Michael," Lucas began in that breezy, too-casual tone he used when he wanted to feign sympathy. "Let's cut to the chase. We appreciate everything you've done here, but it's time for Synertech to move in a new direction. We need a team that's agile, innovative, future-focused. And frankly, your methods, while respectable, don't align with that vision." "Excuse me," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "If this is about the Branson project, I have found critical issues in the—" He held up his hand, silencing me. "This isn't about one project. It's about fit. We're restructuring, and we can't keep people on board who aren't evolving with the times." I stared at him, words failing me. The HR representative on the left slid a folder across the desk. My severance package? They'd planned this, not just today, for weeks. "Lucas," I said finally, steadying my voice, "you're making a mistake. You're chasing shiny tools without understanding the fundamentals. The algorithms you're so proud of, they can't replace experience. They can't replace what I do." His smile was tight, patronizing. "The industry's moving forward, Michael. Maybe it's time you do too." That was it. No acknowledgement of the hours I'd spent saving projects from failure. No mention of the millions I'd saved the company by catching design flaws their software missed. Just a polite shove out the door, like a piece of outdated equipment they no longer needed. I packed my things that afternoon. My team, what was left of it, couldn't meet my eyes. Some mumbled half-hearted goodbyes, others just avoided me altogether, afraid association might paint targets on their own backs. I walked out with my binder still under my arm, the one containing the recalculated Branson project data. Funny thing was, nobody asked for it. The first few days were a blur. I'd been loyal to Synertech for a decade. And for what? To be dismissed like an old filing cabinet gathering dust? I sat at home, staring at my diplomas and commendations, wondering if they meant anything anymore. At night, I replayed the meeting in my head. Lucas's condescending smirk, the HR rep's rehearsed sympathy, my own inability to stop it from happening. Anger came next. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the deep, simmering kind that sharpens you. I thought of all the projects I'd salvaged, all the fires I'd put out, all the times I'd been right when their precious algorithms were wrong. And they'd thrown me away? But beneath the anger was something more dangerous: resolve. Because while Lucas Trent believed I was a relic, I knew the truth. My methods worked. They always had. And if Synertech didn't value them, someone else would. Maybe someone who, when their, quote, innovations inevitably failed, would actually know who to call to save them. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark. Not of revenge, though I'd be lying if I said the thought didn't cross my mind, but of purpose. Lucas thought he'd closed the book on me. He didn't realize I was just turning the page. The first week after my dismissal, I did nothing but stew in quiet anger. I'd wake up at 6 out of habit, drink my coffee and stare at the walls, unsure what to do next. But somewhere in that restless fog, a question began to form. What now? I spent hours combing through my old notes, binders filled with handwritten calculations and design reviews I'd kept over the years. At first it was a way to occupy my mind, but then I noticed something. Patterns. Places where my methods had caught errors their flashy software hadn't even flagged. I wasn't just being sentimental about my old-school ways. They'd been quantifiably better in critical situations. That realization grounded me. I wasn't obsolete. They were blind. By the second week, I was sketching out a plan, not on a laptop, but in my notebooks, where I could think without the distractions of blinking notifications. What did I have? A network of engineers and project managers who respected me, many of whom were quietly unhappy under Lucas's leadership. A reputation in the industry for saving projects that others thought unsalvageable. And, most importantly, a proven methodology for validating complex designs, one that didn't rely on the black box algorithms Lucas worshipped. The first step was to find someone who would value what I brought to the table. That meant talking to competitors. It wasn't as hard as I expected. Word of Synertech's internal chaos had spread fast. I reached out to old contacts, former colleagues who'd jumped ship long before me, industry friends who owed me favors, and within weeks, I had 3 serious offers. One stood out: Meridian Dynamics, a mid-sized firm always overshadowed by giants like Synertech. They'd heard about my firing and, frankly, were eager to poach me, not just for my expertise, but for the statement it would make. During my first meeting with their COO, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Dana Morgan, I laid it out plainly. "You don't need me to teach your engineers how to run simulations," I said. "You need me to teach them how to verify that those simulations are worth a damn." Dana leaned back in her chair, smirking. "I've been saying that for years. Our clients don't care about flashy AI. They care about safety, reliability, deliverables that don't fall apart under real-world stress." That was my in. We negotiated quickly. They offered me not just a senior role, but the freedom to build my own team. People who shared my approach, who understood the balance between technology and fundamentals. But I didn't stop there. My dismissal from Synertech had taught me that loyalty to one employer was dangerous. If they could discard me once, anyone could. So I built something for myself, a personal consulting brand. I called it Harrington Engineering Solutions, offering independent review services for high-risk projects. At first, it was just a name, a logo, and my personal phone number. But I had a vision for it. While setting up my new life, I kept tabs on Synertech. Through friends still working there, I heard the Branson project, the very one I'd flagged, was moving ahead using the flawed AI-generated designs. My warnings had been buried, my binder left behind like it was worthless. And that's when the second part of my plan began to take shape. If Synertech wanted to learn the hard way, so be it. I didn't need to destroy them, they'd do that themselves, but when they inevitably stumbled, when their blind trust in automation led them into crisis, I'd be ready. My goal wasn't revenge. It was to prove, undeniably, that what they called outdated was in fact irreplaceable. I spent nights refining my old methods, codifying them into a streamlined process my new team at Meridian could implement quickly. I wrote guidelines for risk assessment that blended traditional hand calculations with software outputs, ensuring nothing was taken at face value. I trained junior engineers to look past screens, to actually understand the forces at play. Piece by piece, I was building something larger than myself, a blueprint for bringing integrity back to engineering. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making them regret ever underestimating me. When I walked into Meridian Dynamics for my first official day, the atmosphere was nothing like Synertech's. There were no ping-pong tables, no neon-lit innovation hubs, no smug 20-somethings treating experience like a relic. Instead, there were engineers who looked tired but determined. People who knew that their job was about results, not theatrics. Dana met me at the door. "We don't need another manager who likes to hear themselves talk," she said. "We need a builder. You ready?" I was. My first order of business was assembling a team that could execute my hybrid approach, leveraging technology but grounding it in fundamentals. I pulled in two of my old colleagues from Synertech, veterans like me who'd been quietly marginalized but still had sharp instincts. Then I hired a handful of hungry junior engineers, but not the type who chased shiny titles. I wanted learners, people who could respect a system that asked them to slow down and think critically before clicking approve on a simulation. I introduced them to what I called the Harrington Protocol. It wasn't flashy. It was a simple but rigorous framework for cross-verifying computational results with manual calculations and real-world case comparisons. I showed them why simulations failed when the inputs weren't grounded in physical reality, using examples from my binders of past projects. Some of them were stunned by how often the algorithms missed basic errors. At first, there was skepticism. A few of the younger hires muttered about wasting time on hand calculations, but that didn't last long. In our first month, we prevented a multi-million-dollar disaster. One of Meridian's clients, a defense contractor, had planned to approve a design for a modular vehicle frame. Their software results looked perfect, but when we ran the numbers through the Harrington Protocol, we caught a critical flaw. Under asymmetric loading, the frame would buckle. The fix was simple, but would have been catastrophic if ignored. That success gave my team credibility. Word spread quickly inside Meridian. Our division wasn't just reliable. We were saving clients from risks they didn't even know existed. Dana, never one to waste momentum, leveraged those wins in negotiations with new clients. Within 3 months, we'd secured contracts from companies that had previously only done business with giants like Synertech. And speaking of Synertech, they were crumbling. Through my contacts still inside, I learned the Branson project was in crisis. The very issue I'd flagged before being fired, it had materialized. During a mid-phase stress test, one of their prototype wing structures failed catastrophically. It hadn't just delayed the project. It had triggered penalties with their client and regulatory scrutiny from the FAA. Lucas Trent, ever the showman, tried to spin it. Press releases blamed unexpected variables. But I knew exactly what happened. They'd trusted their AI models blindly. They hadn't validated the results. One night, sitting at my desk at home, I looked at the binder that started it all, the recalculated Branson figures, and couldn't help but smile. They'd ignored the very thing that could have saved them. That's when Dana approached me with an idea. "They're gonna need a lifeline," she said, "and I want you to be it." She was right. Within weeks, Synertech, bleeding money and desperate to salvage their reputation, put out quiet feelers for external consultants. Meridian didn't just respond. We made a move that sent a message. Dana pitched me as the lead consultant to stabilize their failing project. Lucas must have hated it. I could almost picture his face when he learned that the man he'd dismissed as old school was now being brought in to clean up his mess. When I walked back into Synertech's headquarters, this time as an external consultant, the looks on their faces said it all. Pity. Regret. And for Lucas, Barely concealed humiliation. He avoided my gaze in the first meeting, delegating interactions to his project managers. I didn't rub it in. I didn't need to. Just being there was enough. In front of the room, I opened my binder, slid the corrected Branson figures across the table, and said simply, "This is where you went wrong." No gloating, no speeches, just facts. And as I spoke, I realized something. This wasn't just about proving Lucas wrong anymore. It was about showing an entire industry that fundamentals still mattered. That experience mattered. That people like me weren't relics. We were the foundation holding it all up. And for the first time since that awful Tuesday, I felt not just vindicated, but powerful. If Synertech expected a quick fix, they were in for a wake-up call. The Branson project wasn't just suffering from a single design flaw. It was riddled with systemic failures born out of arrogance. Their younger team had trusted the AI-generated models without performing even the most basic verification checks. Documentation was sloppy. Safety margins had been minimized in the name of, quote, efficiency. It wasn't engineering. It was gambling with fancy software as the dice. I didn't walk in to save them for their sake. I did it for the engineers on the ground. Good people who'd been steamrolled by Lucas's vision, and for the clients who deserved better than excuses dressed up as unexpected variables. The first meeting with Synertech's Branson team was tense. They didn't want me there, especially not as an outsider. But I wasn't interested in making friends. I laid the binder on the table. The binder, the same one they'd ignored before firing me, and walked them through each point of failure. Your AI model optimized for minimal weight, I explained, but ignored dynamic stressors during takeoff and turbulence. That's why your structure failed the test. One of the younger engineers, clearly embarrassed, mumbled something about, quote, margin factors. I cut him off. Not unkindly, but firmly. You didn't miss the margin factor. You forgot why it was there in the first place. Software doesn't think about consequences. People do. There was silence. Then Dana, who'd accompanied me, leaned in and said, "This is why you hired us." And just like that, the tone shifted. Over the next 6 weeks, my team and I implemented the Harrington protocol across the entire project. Every load-bearing component was reanalyzed using a blend of simulation and manual verification. We reintroduced conservative safety margins, much to the dismay of Synertech's CFO, who complained about increased material costs. I didn't sugarcoat my response. What's more expensive? Slightly heavier materials or a lawsuit when this thing fails in the air? He didn't argue after that. The real turning point came during a high-stakes presentation with the Branson client. Synertech had been hemorrhaging credibility with them, and Lucas insisted on attending, likely hoping to salvage his image. The client, a hard-nosed aerospace exec named Richard Connors, was livid about the delays and demanded answers. Lucas tried to smooth things over with corporate jargon, but Connors cut him off. "I don't want buzzwords. I want to know why I should still trust you." I stepped in, not as a Synertech employee, but as the consultant who'd been called to clean up their disaster. I walked Connors through the recalculations, the corrected models, and most importantly, the protocols we'd implemented to ensure no such oversight would ever happen again. I could see his anger soften as I laid out clear, verifiable solutions. When I finished, Connors looked at Lucas, then back at me. Why wasn't he running this project from the start? Lucas's face turned the color of ash. The client approved the revised plan. The Branson project was saved, not by Lucas's next-gen vision, but by the same old-school fundamentals he'd mocked. After the meeting, Dana pulled me aside, grinning. "You realize what just happened, right? Connors doesn't trust Lucas anymore. He trusts you." She was right. Word of our success spread fast in the industry. Within months, Meridian Dynamics was signing contracts with clients who'd once dismissed them as a secondary player. And those clients weren't just coming from Meridian. They were coming for me. My consulting brand, Harrington Engineering Solutions, was flooded with inquiries from companies desperate for someone who could bridge the gap between modern tech and practical, grounded engineering. Synertech, meanwhile, was in free fall. Lucas's reputation took a beating after the Branson debacle became public. Shareholders were furious about the losses, and whispers of his resignation began circulating. I didn't take pleasure in his downfall, not outwardly at least, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good to see arrogance meet consequences. The sweetest moment came when Dana called me into her office one Friday afternoon. "You'll like this," she said, handing me a file. Inside was a proposal from Synertech, not for a project, but for a merger. Their board wanted Meridian to absorb key divisions of Synertech in exchange for bailing them out. I laughed out loud. The company that fired me for being old school was now begging for my new one to save them. Dana smirked. "So, you want to lead the integration?" I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely. When I walked back into Synertech for the second time, this time as part of the company absorbing them, I found Lucas waiting in the conference room. He looked smaller, diminished. There was no entourage, no smug grin. Just a man who'd finally been forced to face his own limitations. "Michael," he said, almost sheepishly. I didn't expect it to end like this. I looked at him, not with anger, but with the cool clarity of someone who'd already won. That's the thing about engineering, Lucas. If you ignore the fundamentals long enough, failure isn't a possibility. It's inevitable. And with that, we began the work of rebuilding. Not Synertech, but something better, built on respect for both technology and the people who knew how to use it. In the months following the merger, I found myself walking through Synertech's once intimidating glass corridors with a sense of quiet authority. The same walls that had witnessed my humiliation now echoed with conversations about the Harrington Protocol, about hybridizing old and new approaches, about how experience had saved a project once thought unsalvageable. My methods weren't just tolerated anymore. They were the new standard. Lucas didn't last. The board eased him out, though they dressed it up as a, quote, strategic transition. When he handed me his resignation letter during his final week, there was no trace of his old bravado. He didn't apologize, not outright, but his words, "You were right. I didn't see what you brought to the table. We're close enough." I didn't gloat. I simply nodded because I didn't need his validation. The work spoke for itself. Meridian, on the other hand, soared. With Synertech's key contracts and our growing reputation, we transformed into one of the most trusted firms in the industry. My consulting arm expanded as well. I took on projects not for the money but for the challenge, for the thrill of preventing disasters before they happened. Companies didn't hire me for my charm or modernity. They hired me because they knew I'd get it right. But perhaps the most gratifying part of this journey wasn't the professional success. It was mentoring the next generation. Those same junior engineers who once doubted the value of hand calculations were now the ones staying late to cross-verify their software models. They weren't just learning formulas. They were learning how to think like engineers, how to question, how to truly understand the systems they designed. I often caught them explaining my methods to new hires with pride, as if they'd been theirs all along. One evening after a long day, I found myself back at my home office, staring at the old binder that had started everything. I'd thought about throwing it away after the Branson project was resolved, but I couldn't. It wasn't just a collection of numbers and corrections. It was proof. Proof that even in a world obsessed with disruption and speed, fundamentals still mattered. Proof that the work of an old-school engineer could still change the game. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that progress isn't about abandoning the past. It's about knowing which principles endure, which skills remain timeless, and which voices, no matter how unfashionable, are worth listening to. To anyone who's ever been told they're obsolete, that their methods or values are outdated, I'll say this: don't let them write your story for you. Experience isn't a liability. It's leverage. And when used wisely, it can turn dismissal into vindication and humiliation into legacy. The day Synertech fired me, they thought they'd erased me. What they didn't realize was that they just handed me the pen. And I wrote a better ending than they ever could have imagined. Moral: respect isn't owed to flashy titles, trends, or technologies. It's owed to competence, integrity, and the people who refuse to cut corners when it matters most. Progress doesn't come from discarding the old for the new. It comes from building bridges between them, one calculated step at a time.